For decades, Gavin MacFadyen was at the forefront of investigative journalism, uncovering corruption, exposing wrongdoing, and holding the powerful accountable. But what many didn't know at the time was that his work made him a target. Someone the FBI kept a close eye on, documenting his every move, his contacts, and his investigations. Today, we're diving into the vaults, into the files labeled SM-X. The shadowy world of surveillance that kept watch over MacFadyen and his associates. This isn't speculation. This isn't theory. These are the FBI's own records, now declassified and sitting in the open, revealing a system built to monitor, track, and intimidate those who dare to ask uncomfortable questions. In this episode, we'll explore who watched him, why, and how far the Bureau went into their surveillance. And as we do, I want you to remember one thing. The pursuit of truth has a cost. And sometimes, the truth is being watched even before it's spoken. Gavin MacFadyen was not a fringe figure. He was an investigative journalist, a documentary filmmaker. His work took him to controversial zones, exposing corruption, interrogating secrecy, and giving voice to stories others preferred to stay silent. But sitting behind the headlines was another story, one recorded by the government archives. Under the SM-X classification, the FBI monitored MacFadyen's surveillance and activity. Files show that starting in the early 1960s and continuing through decades later, agents and informants kept him under close watch. What did that surveillance look like? Informant reports, individuals reporting on his movements, meetings, and associations, internal memos, references to MacFadyen's investigative topics, even labeling them as sensitive or radical. File classification under SM-X. The same designation used for UFO files and other unusual investigations. One early memo labels him as a person of interest under SM-X, with comments from a confidential source about his affiliations and ideological leanings. Another document details how an informant claimed MacFadyen had met up with dissident groups abroad, promoting further surveillance. These aren't the stories MacFadyen was writing. They're the stories that were written about him. They show a man under scrutiny, not just for what he published, but for whom he spoke to, where he traveled, and what he asked. You'll notice something unsettling. In these documents, there's little distinction between legitimate journalism and what the surveillors considered suspicious behavior. Curiosity becomes justification. Investigation becomes a threat. For MacFadyen, surveillance wasn't incidental. It was part of the system's response to his very presence. When you open up the FBI's file on Gavin MacFadyen, you don't just see a man. You see a system. The pages read like a manual on how to watch someone who questions power. A June 1971 memo labeled Security Matter-X notes MacFadyen's travel abroad to meet with dissidents. Agents flagged his interviews as potential subversive activity, even though he was working on a documentary at the time. Another document from the early 1980s shows how informants inside activist and journalistic circles were tasked with feeding back intelligence on who MacFadyen was speaking to. In one case, a confidential source provided details of his personal meetings and even his hotel bookings. Perhaps most chillingly, a 1984 memo explicitly weighs the risk to national security of allowing MacFadyen to continue his investigations into U.S. covert activities abroad. The memo is vague, almost coded, but the implication is clear. His journalism was being evaluated as a threat. These weren't isolated notes. The file shows a pattern. MacFadyen's work would trigger a red flag, a memo, a field report, only to flare up again when his next investigation gained traction. And all of it was hidden under the SM-X label, a classification typically reserved for sensitive or extraordinary cases. The same label used for UFOs, espionage, and potentially embarrassing government matters. By the time Gavin MacFadyen founded the Center for Investigative Journalism in London and later WikiLeaks Journalism School, his reputation was already sealed. He was the guy who made the powerful sweat. He mentored whistleblowers, protected sources, and trained journalists in how to dig where governments didn't want them to. And that's what made him dangerous. Not because he was violent, not because he was subversive, but because he was effective. The FBI files never explicitly say why he was classified under SM-X, but the context speaks volumes. The label was reserved for cases that were politically sensitive or potentially damaging if exposed. MacFadyen's work on CIA operations in Latin America, arms deals, and covert funding of rebel groups fell squarely into that category. To the Bureau, MacFadyen wasn't a journalist. He was an information node, a hub through which sensitive materials flowed. The surveillance wasn't about a single documentary or article. It was about choking off a network of people and leaks before it grew too large to contain. And yet, even under watch, he kept going. His legacy lives in every major leak and expose that came after, from the Panama Papers to Edward Snowden's revelations. MacFadyen helped build the blueprint for how modern whistleblowing works. The files you can read today don't show a criminal. They show a government trying to understand and quietly neutralize the kind of journalism that refuses to die. That's the uncomfortable truth in these pages. The FBI's X-Files weren't just about flying saucers. They were about people. People like Gavin MacFadyen who challenged the narrative, connected dots, and taught others how to do the same. Gavin MacFadyen passed away in 2016, but the surveillance and the pressure never truly ended when he was alive. The SM-X file may have closed, but the implications lingered. For those under watch, the fear of being mischaracterized, the quiet tracking of communications, and the knowledge that your work could draw unwanted attention never fully disappears. MacFadyen's legacy isn't as much about what he taught the next generation of journalists as it is about the stories he directly exposed. From whistleblowers in the US to activists around the world, his methods shaped investigative journalism for decades. The files show a man who was unrelenting in his pursuit of truth, and that persistence inspired others to continue, even when the government scrutiny became intense. Perhaps the most telling legacy is this. While the Bureau tried to categorize, monitor, and neutralize him as a threat, MacFadyen's influence grew. The SM-X designation didn't stop leaks. It only highlighted the power of transparency and the fear it can provoke in institutions unwilling to be held accountable. Gavin MacFadyen's story isn't about secrets. It's about courage. The courage to dig, to expose, and to train others to do the same, even under scrutiny. As we close this file, remember, history often remembers the whistleblowers, not the watchers. And next time on Stories from the Vault, we dive deeper into COINTELPRO, the controversial FBI program that infiltrated and disrupted political movements across the US. A chilling reminder of how far surveillance can go when fear outweighs accountability. I'm Kyle Fields. Good day.